You think the craziest parts of Bond history are already behind us? They're not, because some of the most dangerous decisions in 007 history were almost invisible to the audience. They didn't look controversial. They didn't look risky. But they changed everything, and it gets stranger. Roger Moore once pushed the tone of Bond so far into humor that even he later admitted some scenes went too cartoonish. Especially in Moonraker. The film jumped on the space craze after Star Wars exploded. Lasers, space stations, zero-gravity battles. Bond literally in orbit. It made huge money. But it proved something dangerous. The franchise was willing to chase trends instead of set them. But here's where it gets bold. The PRA title sequence of The Spy Who Loved Me features one of the most legendary stunts ever filmed. Bond skis off a cliff, free falls for several seconds, and then a Union Jack parachute opens mid-air. Audiences in 1977 reportedly gasped, then erupted into applause. The stunt was so risky that the cameraman initially thought the jumper had died because the parachute deployed later than expected. That wasn't CGI spectacle. That was real gravity, real risk, real terror captured on film. And then something happened that almost rewrote Bond at the molecular level. When Timothy Dalton took over in The Living Daylights and later License to Kill, he deliberately played Bond closer to the original novels. Colder, more intense, less flirty, more dangerous. But audiences at the time weren't ready for that shift. The box office dipped, and the darker interpretation was cut short. Years later, critics would argue Dalton was simply ahead of his time, foreshadowing the Daniel Craig era by almost 2 decades. Here's a subtle one that hardcore fans obsess over. In Goldfinger, the laser scene where Bond is strapped to a table and calmly asks, "Do you expect me to talk?" became iconic, but originally it was supposed to be a simple buzzsaw. The change to a laser was inspired by emerging technology fears of the 1960s. That single prop swap made the scene feel futuristic and terrifying. It cemented the Bond formula of high-tech menace. But let's talk about something most people never question. The theme songs. The Bond franchise didn't just create spy cinema tropes. It built a parallel music legacy. From Shirley Bassey belting Goldfinger to Adele delivering Skyfall, landing an Academy Award. These songs are not background decoration. They set emotional tone before the story even begins. And landing a Bond theme is considered a career milestone in the music industry. Very few franchises can claim that kind of cultural power. And it gets even more layered. Quantum of Solace confused audiences because the title sounded abstract and vague, but it's pulled directly from an Ian Fleming short story. Meaning even when the films modernize and globalize, they are still quietly mining deep cuts from the original literary canon. Now here's something that feels almost unreal. For decades, Blofeld, Bond's iconic bald-headed nemesis, was referenced indirectly without showing his face because of legal rights disputes. White Cat, spinning chair, faceless menace. The character became more myth than man, and when he finally reappeared fully in Spectre, played by Christoph Waltz, the weight of that reintroduction carried decades of legal and narrative baggage. And here's the psychological twist most casual viewers miss. James Bond rarely sleeps peacefully on screen. He is often shown drinking alone, isolated in hotel rooms, staring into nothing. The glamour hides something colder underneath. Whether intentional or not, the films repeatedly hint that Bond is not built for happiness. He is built for mission after mission, and when he tries to escape that cycle, it costs him everything. So now, the tension isn't just about who plays Bond next. It's about what version of masculinity, power, and patriotism the next era will project. Because Bond has always mirrored the anxieties of his time. And if history tells us anything, the next transformation won't be safe. It won't be predictable. And it definitely won't be quiet. But just when you think the franchise has revealed all its secrets, another layer peels back. Because some of the most insane Bond facts were hiding in plain sight the entire time, and it gets stranger. The name James Bond was never meant to sound glamorous. Ian Fleming deliberately chose it because it was plain, almost boring. He took it from a real American ornithologist named James Bond whose book sat on his shelf. Fleming wanted the dullest name possible for a man who would live the most extraordinary life. The irony. Today it's one of the most iconic names in pop culture history. Here's where things quietly change the formula forever. In For Your Eyes Only, the producers deliberately scaled back the SUAFI excess after Moonraker. No space lasers, no cartoon spectacle. They returned to grounded espionage because critics were starting to question whether Bond had become self-parody. This was one of the first times the franchise openly course-corrected in response to backlash, and then something happened that almost no one noticed. When Christopher Lee played Scaramanga in The Man with the Golden Gun, he brought real-life intelligence connections with him. Lee was related by marriage to Ian Fleming and had served in British intelligence during World War II. For a brief moment, a man with an actual intelligence background portrayed a Bond villain. The line between fiction and reality blurred. Here's a production detail that sounds fake. The crocodile farm escape in Live and Let Die, where Bond runs across the backs of snapping crocodiles, was performed practically by a real crocodile handler. No visual tricks, no hidden platforms, just timed steps across live animals. One slip would have been catastrophic. That sequence still makes modern stunt coordinators nervous, and it gets even more unexpected. The Aston Martin DB5, now inseparable from Bond's image, was not originally planned to become such a defining symbol. It appeared in Goldfinger with gadgets that captured the public imagination so strongly that the car became a CO star. The DB5 has reappeared across multiple eras, turning a luxury vehicle into cinematic mythology. Here's something subtle but powerful. In Casino Royale, the torture scene marked one of the rare times Bond is completely stripped of control. Tied naked to a chair, beaten, mocked. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't stylized. It was uncomfortable. That creative decision signaled that this era of Bond would not protect its hero from humiliation or pain. And then there's the legal chess game that shaped the villain landscape for decades. Because of rights disputes surrounding Spectre, the films avoided directly using Blofeld and the full criminal network for years. Writers were forced to invent new shadow organizations. Some of the most iconic enemies were absent not for story reasons, but because of courtroom battles happening far from the cameras. But here's the part that reframes everything. James Bond has survived multiple cultural revolutions. The sexual revolution of the 60s, the gritty realism wave of the 80s, post 9/11 paranoia, the rise of superhero dominance, the streaming explosion. Yet, unlike most franchises, Bond never abandoned theatrical spectacle. He remained tied to cinema as an event. That scale is why every new casting feels like a global announcement, not just another reboot. So the question isn't just who steps into the tuxedo next. It's whether the next chapter embraces tradition or detonates it. Because history shows that every time Bond seems cornered, the franchise doesn't retreat. It mutates, and if the past is any indication, the next mutation might be the most shocking yet. But before we close this file on James Bond, there are a few final truths that hit harder than any explosion. Because they're not about spectacle. They're about legacy, and it gets stranger. Sean Connery eventually grew tired of the role that made him immortal. He once said he was fed up to here with the whole Bond bit. Imagine that. The man who defined the character felt trapped by him. Fame became a cage. And yet, decades later, when Connery passed away, the world didn't just mourn an actor. It mourned the original face of Bond. The role outlived even the man who perfected it. Here's something quietly powerful. The final line of On Her Majesty's Secret Service, when Bond cradles Tracy's body and says, "We have all the time in the world," wasn't just dialogue. It became a musical theme that echoed through later films, including No Time to Die. That callback wasn't nostalgia. It was emotional continuity. A reminder that even when the timeline resets, the grief lingers, and then something happened that felt almost poetic. When Daniel Craig filmed his final scene in No Time to Die, the cast and crew reportedly gave him a long-standing ovation. Craig, who once said he would rather slash his wrists than play Bond again after Spectre, stood there visibly emotional. After 15 years, the character had reshaped him. The role that once exhausted him had become part of his identity. But here's the detail that plays with your nerves. In No Time to Die, Bond doesn't die anonymously saving the world. He dies knowing he has a daughter, knowing she will grow up without him. That shift reframes the entire franchise. For decades, Bond avoided permanence, avoided fatherhood, avoided consequence. In the end, the thing that destroys him isn't a supervillain's ego, it's love. And if you look back at the entire saga, from Dr. No to No Time to Die, a pattern emerges. Bond is most dangerous when he has nothing to lose, but he becomes most human the moment he finally has something to live for. That contradiction powered the character for 60 years. Maybe the most heartbreaking fact of all is this: every actor who plays Bond eventually walks away. Willingly or not, the tuxedo stays. The music swells, the gun barrel turns, but the man inside changes. Again and again, Bond feels permanent. The actor never is. So when the next actor steps forward, he won't just take on a role. He'll step into a lineage built on risk, ego, reinvention, backlash, triumph, and loss. Because James Bond isn't just a spy. He's a reflection of how each generation defines power, masculinity, loyalty, and sacrifice. And here's the uncomfortable truth that lingers after the credits roll. If Bond can die, if the myth can bend, if the formula can break, then the most dangerous mission ahead isn't for the character. It's for the franchise itself. Because the next chapter won't just decide who Bond is. It will decide whether the legend survives at all.